Part 4. The Middle Kingdom. Real property disputes, contracts, and taxation. We last left off with an overview of policing and early criminal procedure under Pharaoh Amenemhet. So we have Pharaoh Amenemhet, who creates the first police force. He was also called Ameni as a somewhat of a nickname. And somewhat ironically, he's then murdered by his own guards. His undoing is explained in a poetic script probably written by his son and successor Sesostris, but penned as if he himself had written it. And in it he says that weapons intended for his own protection were turned against him. So much for the big law enforcement pharaoh. Sesostris then gained the throne. But before moving on to Sesostris, we need to note something else that Amenemhet did, and I mentioned it in the last video. He restored the property surveying system and implemented or re-implemented property courts. We are now entering the world of property law. In the second video of this series, I discussed the tale of the eloquent peasant, the story being one, essentially, of property law. Just to summarize or recap, a peasant trader was going to market with his caravan. A landowner blocked the road, abutted on one side by a river and the other by his own field of barley. And the peasant had a choice to make, either trod in the expensive cloth used as a roadblock, deviously laid across the road by the landowner, or to venture into the barley field to circumvent the barricade. And he chose the latter, quickly realizing that he made a mistake when one of his pack animals chomped on some barley. And then the landowner, who was lying in wait, suddenly emerged, asserting his right to confiscate the entire caravan due to damages for the trespass. The local judges had initially sided with the landowner, making it clear that in the Old Kingdom at least, trespass on property was curable by confiscation of goods as damages, without recourse and without regard to proportionality of punishment. Cooler heads prevailed, though, once the peasant made his case and appealed to the principles of fairness and justice, resulting in him becoming the owner of the now enslaved landowner. As heartwarming as that story is, it has some real implications for us. The primary one is that private property existed. Some scholars, some legal scholars and Egyptologists out there, have a debate ongoing as to whether private property technically existed, because the pharaoh or temples were known to hold vast swaths of territory in their own right. But in the tale of the eloquent peasant and the Mentuhotep inscription, it makes clear that at very least property, even if it wasn't technically private, was at least treated as being private, with mechanisms in place to set boundaries and adjudicate disputes between neighbors. Complicating the issue of property ownership is the fact that the Nile floods the valley every year. All of this farmland is right up against the Nile. And how do you divide the farmland? You have boundary markers and you have fences. Well, when the Nile floods, they all get washed away or covered in silt. So what do? You need records. The boundaries of the property need to be reset by the government. The issue here in the early Middle Kingdom is that during the intermediate period, the 200 years of chaos preceding the Middle Kingdom, nobody was doing that. So once the Middle Kingdom finally emerges, there's really no indication of who owns what. Amenemhet was the first pharaoh that at least we know of to reinstate the property surveys. An inscription from the 12th dynasty of a man named Mentuhotep, who served under Amenemhet's successor Sesostris, has little historical significance except for the fact that he was the vizier, and amongst his titles were prophet of Mot, judge, vizier, chief judge, and hereditary prince. He calls himself the giver of laws, the advancer of offices, and the confirmer of the property records separating a landowner from his neighbor. Now, question is, whose responsibility was it to keep the records? Well, what was Mentuhotep? He was the vizier. Among his many other duties as a judge, he was also the custodian of property records, including sale contracts and transfers of real estate. How does sales work? It's a little bit unclear, because we have pharaohs who give people entire towns as endowments to fund mortuary temples. but you also have people in these same towns asserting private ownership of property. This is a pre-money society, so they don't have money or coinage. The workers are all paid in barley, bread, beer, and in other commodities, and larger transactions were conducted in silver. I don't see the same sort of reckoning of, let's say, grain prices, for instance, with precious metals that's present in Mesopotamia around the same time, but it looks to be somewhat similar. So my question is, how does the pharaoh own a town and, let's say, endow it to somebody's mortuary temple when an individual person owns a parcel in that town? And I think that the answer is taxation. And taxation and property, as you all know, goes hand in hand. Taxation in Egypt was straightforward. At least in the early days through the Middle Kingdom, it was based on the Nile. They had these devices, they were called Nilometers, which would measure the annual inundation of the Nile. Over the now 1,500 years that Egypt has existed, the government officials observed that the degree of inundation directly affects agricultural output, meaning that if the Nile floods this much, then you should be able to grow this much, and you should be able to afford to give this much to the government. So the answer to the question is, the pharaoh isn't really the owner of the towns, but owns a percentage of the goods produced therein through taxation, which could then be endowed to a tomb or used for other purposes, say stockpiling or what have you. The land list held by the vizier or the local nomarch doubled as a tax list, so they always knew who to collect from. So in order to have taxation, Amenemhet needed to refresh the property records and set the boundaries again. There is a school of thought out there that the pharaoh really did own everything, and that the local populace, they were essentially serfs. They were tied to the land, and they would work the land and kick up to the pharaoh, but they're still recognized as having property rights, so they're not slaves or anything. In the event of a trespass or something, these people would have the right to sue for redress. Private leases of property were also a thing, and those went by contract. We do have some contracts from the Middle Kingdom period. We have a bunch of contracts from a guy named Hebzefi, and they're mortuary contracts for his tomb, kind of like we spoke about earlier. The contracts record what Hebzefi gave the mortuary priest, including bread on certain days, the share of the proceeds of a bull, several jars of beer, etc., in exchange for the priest making offerings on specific days. In this, we have consideration, which is an exchange for goods or a giving up of something by either party, and other provisions, including 1, where the contracted goods from Hebzefi, who's dead by the time of its enactment, should come from, and 2, who should take over the contract on behalf of the mortuary priests when the living priests eventually die. I don't have any examples of leases, unfortunately. We will now return to the chronological timeline with Sesostris and his successors, who were mainly focused with expanding Egyptian influence, reestablishing trade, and also reestablishing mining. There's really not much in the way of law in any of the inscriptions from Sesostris I onward. We have several inscriptions from different officials in the 12th dynasty, mostly noting different expeditions in the Sinai and Nubia for trade and mining. Most of them are written in a disgustingly indulgent way, saying how much the pharaoh loved them and how they were all his one true confidant, blah 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 blah. What's important here is that when the Middle Kingdom emerged, it provided stability. Stability meant surplus. And when you have a surplus of resources, you could have a standing army to beat up people at your leisure. And they did a lot of beating people up, mainly Nubians in the south, but also in Sinai and in southern Canaan. Herodotus talks about a great pharaoh, Sesostris III in our timeline, who conquered Nubia in the south and then turned north, marching and conquering all the way up to Syria. His claims about the extent of the expansion appear to be somewhat exaggerated. But we do have something called the Stele of Zah, referencing an Egyptian invasion of Syria during Sesostris III's reign, but it looks to have been a plundering expedition, whereas Herodotus seems to intimate that he occupied the place. Whatever you want to call it, it's clear that Sesostris III expanded the Egyptian sphere of influence into Canaan. That, combined with an influx of gold and other resources from Nubia, caused North Near Eastern trade to flourish, and migrants from Canaan and Mesopotamia started pouring into the Delta, seeking a share of the wealth and the glory. They ended up forming their own insulated communities in the Delta region. So what we have here now is that all of this winning is going to wind up to be Egypt's undoing. This is the second time Egypt has been undone in a mere 200 years. Around 1800 BC, these Asiatic migrants reached a critical mass and seized upon a crucial opportunity to gain power. Queen Sobek-Neferu died without an heir, creating a succession dispute. Without an heir, there was nobody to protect or impose the divine order, and it was disrupted once more. This time, the disruption itself became the genesis of an arguably more divine order that persists to this day. This is the arrival of Joseph and the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period, the topic of my next video. Thank you for watching.